Turn the air down.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Kevin L. Booker Jr., and I will be your moderator for this discussion this evening. The title of tonight's discussion is From Civil Rights to Black Lives Matter, Trailblazers' Perspectives on the Fight for Racial Justice. In our time together this evening, we will discuss similarities and differences in the movements for racial justice in the 20th and 21st centuries. Panelists will share personal experiences and leave the audience with a call to action. I would love to welcome my extraordinary panelists this evening. It is a pleasure and honor to have you here this evening in this Zoom call. So each panelist will share their name, profession and title, the town you live in, also your age, and why you are here this evening. I'll start off with Reverend Florence Clark.
Good evening. My name is Florence Clark. I am the former pastor, retired, of the Walls Clark Temple AME Zion Church in New London, Connecticut. I do live in Connecticut. I've been here close to 50 years. And I'm here tonight because I'm grateful to God that I have lived to see this time, this day, and I still have a voice and I believe something to say.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, Reverend Clark. And next we have—
I'm 79.
Oh, no. Thank you very much, Reverend Florence Clark. And next we have Miss Gwendolyn Mccoy.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Gwendolyn Mccoy, and I am a senior consultant with Diversity at Workplace, which is a consultancy based out of Cambridge, Massachusetts, where we go into organizations and provide guidance around diversity, equity, and inclusion. I am based out of Boston, Massachusetts, and I am 54, almost 55 come December.
Thank you very much, Ms. Gwendolyn Mccoy. And next we have Attorney Lonnie Braxton.
Good evening. My name is Lonnie Braxton. I live in New London, Connecticut. I grew up in Mississippi, got out of the Navy in Norfolk, moved here because the best schools and best chances were in Connecticut, according to my way of thinking. I am 72, almost 73 years old. And the real reason I'm here is because when you look at the age of the people on this panel, we are looking down a road that there's less road in front of us than there is behind us. And I'm hoping, and after speaking to the panelists over the course of time, that we all want to make sure that what we know gets shared and that the stories never die.
Thank you very much, Attorney Braxton. And our last and our finest is Senior Chief James Mosley. Mr. Mosley.
Yeah, my name is James Mosley. I'm a retired Navy submarine veteran and retired from General Dynamics as a buyer and a government programs administrator. I live in Waterford, Connecticut. I've been here for approximately over 60 years in Waterford, Connecticut. And my age, I'll be 91 in 3 days.
Wow.
You freeze?
That is awesome. Thank you very much, Mr. Mosley. So now we're going to move right into the discussion. And it's our honor to be part of this discussion, to moderate this discussion this evening. So the first question that comes to my mind is, what similarities do you see in the movements for racial justice in the 20th and 21st centuries? Reverend Clark.
The similarities that I see going back to when I started, I was a college student and we were marching. I loved to see the marching. It was so productive. when we were in college. I remember some things that happened during the march that was similar that's happening today. We were sprayed with fire hoses from the fire department. We were arrested and placed, and because they didn't have enough cells to place over 700 students. And so they took us to the fairground and put us in animal cages. So I see the similarity of the marches and what's transpiring.
Thank you very much, Reverend Clarke. And Attorney Braxton.
The similarities I see, young people.
Mhm.
But I guess my take on things a little different. In 1918, it was adults. A lot of servicemen, a lot of adults who have come from the South to Chicago, big cities, who decided they'd had enough of bad housing, discrimination, and just being brutalized. And in the 60s, the kids took to the streets. And again, when you look at the beginning of this new movement in itself, a lot of young people are out there. But the other big difference is, if you remember Freedom Summer, when a lot of kids left Connecticut, New York, and what have you, they came south, they were white kids. Their parents were very, very careful by making sure their kids were looked after and protected. And this time, what do we see in the streets? A totally diverse and mixed crowd of people who are all seeking the same thing, justice.
Wow. Thank you very much, Attorney Braxton. Ms. McCoy.
So the interesting thing for me is always this comparison between 1968, when I was only 3 years old, and now. And when I look back and I watch documentaries and even understand and recognize that in the neighborhood where I live, that they literally burned it down in protest at the assassination of Martin Luther King. And so I look at that moment in time in history and understood that there was a lot of unrest that led to those particular moments. The same thing to me has happened in 2020, where you have the pandemic and the adverse impacts in terms of health disparities amongst Black and Brown people. We looked at the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and it's that moment in time, those buildup of all of these different issues, which is very much reminiscent of that time in '68 and that time in 1992 as well. So that's the similarities that I see. And I'm oftentimes, when I'm teaching, especially teaching white folks about our history, that I look back at those times and recount those times for them to let them know that this has happened before. And this is the reason why this is a little bit different, because we're now learning more of our history and we understand the linkages, and this is not a moment that will stop.
Thank you very much, Ms. McCoy. And Mr. Mosley, the senior of the bunch.
The similarities and is what a few people mentioned already. During my period of time, I went in the Navy when it was segregated in 1948. And then she mentioned 68, where we know what was going on in 68, because one day at Electric Boat, when I started, Martin Luther King was assassinated the next day, April the 4th. He was assassinated. I started at Electric Boat at that period of time. But the similarities today, we see protests. Back in the 60s, 50s, and 60s, it was a different types of protests. What it is now, there's more mixed, even though there were some back at that time, in the Freedom Riders and those periods of time. But now you're seeing a lot of the younger people getting involved in the racial incidents in this country today. And the similarities is still all protests against the government itself. And so I think I mentioned yesterday that I'm writing a book now on American history, and we have to learn more about our own history for similarities, traits, voting, etc. But it's basically the similarities. There's a lot of similarities between the groups that are 50s and 60s and the ones in the 21st century.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mosley. So when you talk about the similarities and you talk about protesting, you see the racial dynamics begin to shift as well in the 21st century. How would you describe progress in the fight for racial justice? And what opportunities for change do you see possible now that you did not see 20 to 30 years ago? Attorney Braxton.
Well, I'm rethinking this question. I'm sitting out of my garage and I've been working for a couple of weeks on a talk I have to give to a number of attorneys about housing and racial discrimination. And one of the big things that I see now in this fight is that there has been a lot more contact in the last 30 years between people of different ethnic groups than there had ever been in the past. And when you sit for Thanksgiving dinner and you're the majority in this country, there are a lot more people who are going to have someone who is Black, brown, or whatever sitting at that Thanksgiving table. And things that you don't know, you tend to fear. And you may not know a lot of Black people or a lot of brown people, but you will now know some people. Dr. King made an interesting statement on more than one occasion. He said the most segregated day in America is Sunday, because everybody went to separate church. Well, people also went to their homes and their neighborhoods, and there was so much that was put together to make sure that these neighborhoods would stay segregated, that people would stay segregated. But the kids have basically taken on, I think, a different take. They interact a lot more with each other than generations in the past. And they tend to spend that kind of time that they learn a lot more. And we see a lot more of ourselves on various shows and magazines. We're not always depicted in the best light, but that light is still better than the light we were depicted in 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, when you saw an advertisement, a movie, or what have you, or TV.
Thank you, Mr. Braxton. And just to re-emphasize what Mr. Braxton was saying, he said the children now interact with each other more now than they did in the past. So Reverend Clarke, what are some of the changes that you see also as well, and that you did not see 20, 30 years ago?
I was born and raised in Charleston, South Carolina. Under Jim Crow, everything was separate but unequal. And there was no chance for diversity. When we were in school, we got textbooks, the ones where the backs were broken, and no chance of sitting next to a white child in school. What I see now as progress is I'm in a program called Encountering Differences, where I, as a Black mentor, am mentoring white students from suburban schools. They actually come to my home, they sup with me, they ask questions about my upbringing in the South, explain the difference between then and now. But for me, as a Black former high school teacher and substitute teacher in the area, to actually sit and talk to white kids from the suburbs, and those kids had actually had no relationship with any African American. My home, Lonnie's home, Lonnie's office was the first time that they ever had a chance to sit and actually talk with an African American.
Jeez.
The possibility for, wow.
Wow.
I love what I see now with all, I'm so excited about the young people. I just want to get out there and start marching again. Jeez, I do, but I see what's happening. It's like a transfusion,
Mm,
and I'm very, very happy to see what's happening now compared to years ago.
wow. Thank you very much, Reverend Clarke. Mr. Mosley, how are you feeling right now?
I'm feeling well.
You feeling
Really
well?
well.
And when you think about those 20, 30 years, what are some of the things you have seen change?
That seen change. Well, she just went over quite a few, and the main one is that a lot of young whites who hasn't been indoctrinated, even some by their parents, about racism, they're seeing more. And I've always told everyone, the younger generation in this country is going to really save this country from destruction, because you're seeing more of it. For example, in Portland, Oregon, it's only 6%. They've been protesting out there for months. Only 6% of the inhabitants in Portland are African Americans. Most of the protests are by whites. In other areas, and I've been to Portland quite a few times, and there's very few black, and parts of Wisconsin also, very few blacks that they're, but most of the protests right now is the young whites. And I've told many people, which is going to be in my next book, about the younger people in this country is going to really change this country and make it live up to its creed that's stated in the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence. And I think the change is coming, and you can't put your finger in the dike and stop it. It's coming, and no one will be able to stop it. So it's better days ahead. But
Thank you,
the job is not done.
Wow. Thank you, Mr. Mosley. And Ms. McCoy.
So I agree with everything the other panelists said. And what I would add to it is this. First off, yes, there is still levels of segregation in some states. What young people are afforded is this, the internet and social media to be able to connect across state lines, across the globe. So that makes them a little bit more familiar with certain things, but the conversations that they have with Reverend Clarke are much more valuable, because that intimate, right across the table conversations is what really embeds and activates their drive to social justice. And so one of the things that we talk about during our training is unconscious bias. And Attorney Braxton talked about the fact these conversations is when you get to know people. The more you know people, the more you trust them. And as you trust them, then you are going to advocate and fight for them as well. And then the last point would be that Gen Z, so those are the folks that were born that are 22 and under. So they have lived a different existence than any generation that has come before them, because they have seen a couple of recessions. They have now lived through a pandemic. They have also been the ones that have gone through drills for school shootings. So they have a particular sense of social justice and moving things forward, because their colleagues next to them, the ones that they go to school with, they're Black and brown as well. So those are the things that, to me, make this such a better and great time.
Thank you very much, Ms. McCoy. And when we think about those trials and tribulations that we're referring to, and the differences and the similarities that we have seen, many of you on this panel have seen and experienced. Can you also describe your experience with segregation prior to civil rights, the civil rights movement? Now, what was your experience like prior to the civil rights movement? As many of you seen, and experienced some other atrocities that occurred, and many people are unaware of some of the things that you have experienced as well. So, Mr. Mosley, I'll start with you.
Okay. Prior to the civil rights, uh, I was in the military at the time, and in the 40s, early 50s, and so forth. And I was stationed in the South most of the time, quite a bit of the time. And so I saw everything firsthand, even in the military. And when I went overseas, I was treated better with a uniform on overseas than I was right in this country.
Wow.
So during that period of time, in the 40s and early 50s, there was quite a bit of segregation, not only in the military, but the streets and so forth. And one particular incident when I was on a submarine heading for Japan, and this was right in September of 57, when in Little Rock, Central High School in Little Rock was being integrated. And I walked past the wardroom and had two officers talking about what was going on in Little Rock, Arkansas. And the one officer said, what do they want? And I turned around and came back because I was walking past. I said, they want their children to have the same type of education as you have. And nothing ever was said for them. But during the period, not the period in the Navy, the 20 years on active duty, I saw quite a bit because I was stationed in Maryland, Virginia, South Carolina, Florida, Virginia, all over. And the only time I didn't feel it, basically, when I was on the West Coast on a submarine in San Diego. But when I was on the East Coast, Norfolk, Charleston, all these places, it was quite a bit of segregation and racism, not only in the area, but also some of your own shipmates. I saw it firsthand, most of it firsthand.
Wow.
But
Thank
people
you.
are shocked when I tell them I was treated better overseas, which is true, I'm not lying. I was treated better overseas than I was here.
And how did you feel when you had to come back to this country?
When you
after
come
being
back into the
treated
country, you just face it, and you're in the military, and but you learn a lot by listening to people, watching people, and you've read my book, and so a lot of that's right in that book about some of the incidents that in the military, and I was denied once when I went in. That was my first time. My first time was in 1948 when I was supposed to go to flight school and I wasn't allowed to.
That's right.
But they said something was wrong with my teeth, which it wasn't.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
But I've seen quite a bit in my time, quite a bit. But it is changing. It is changing for the better with the young people. The young people are making a difference. And even children in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, when they get in school, some of the teachers need to have different ethnic groups, dolls or whatever, to let the children know that there's different classes of people in the world and you have to respect everybody. But the young people is going to change this country. I'll still say that.
Thank you, Mr. Mosley.
Okay.
Reverend Clarke, what are some of the things you're thinking of now coming from South Carolina? Some of the things that you had to experience as well prior to the civil rights movement.
I guess my early days in elementary school, well, growing up in my neighborhood, the one thing that I'm grateful for is that all of the adults in the neighborhood were our elders, and they were basically mothers, and the gentlemen were fathers for all of the kids. I remember there used to be a certain time during the day when particularly the mothers would gather the kids and said, you have to come in because the riders are coming. So thinking cowboys and Indians, we are thinking in terms of that. And later on to find out that they were bringing us in because the Ku Klux Klan would be coming through. I remember going to everything was segregated, and going to the Buste Elementary School right across the street from Emmanuel, AME Church. Emmanuel was the mother church for my denomination at that time. And so when we wanted to have plays, the school didn't have a stage or anything. So Mother Emmanuel opened up their basement where they had we could have plays and other things, just like the other kids who had auditoriums. So the stage, the basement at Emmanuel AME Church, I grew up running up and down those steps at Emmanuel. So what happened there was devastating to me. Also, I remember another incident where we would go to the Five and Dime, F.W. Woolworth and Silver's. And of course, you couldn't eat at the counters, but everything, the water fountains were labeled, colored, and white. So I remember being very naive and going into F.W. Woolworth, and I saw the sign that says colored and white. So I drank from the white fountain. And when I went home, I got home and I told my grandmother. She was so afraid that she said, "You're not supposed to drink from the white fountain." So I said to her, "Well, who wants to drink colored water?" That's how naive I was at the time, until we were actually taught the difference between what's colored, what's white, where were the boundaries. Also, in my neighborhood, it was kind of diverse. I remember a Polish family, Italian family, and a Jewish family. And at that time, there was a little white girl my age, and we were good friends. You know, we pulled the grass out of the ground, stuck the grass inside of a Coke bottle, and we learned how to braid with the roots. But something happened the day that she went to school and we started school. That evening when we came out to play, she said, "I can't play with you anymore." So I said, "Well, why?" She said, "Because you're an N."
Oh my gosh.
And I beat her up. I whipped the snot out of her, excuse my expression. I was so hurt and I couldn't understand. And then that was the beginning of my lesson. We couldn't go to the swimming pool, the municipal swimming pool for every kid, but there was a sign on the outside that it was for whites only, because if Black kids got in, the ink from our bodies would turn the water black. We didn't have a skating rink, so what they would do is block off the streets so that the Black kids we had to skate in the streets. But the streets that were blocked off, white people didn't care. They just drove by so many times. They almost hit the kids with the car because it was something that they had no respect for. So there were so many things, but these things were in us when we were growing up, and it made a difference. And that's why I'm fighting today.
Thank you so much, Reverend Clarke, for sharing that. Thank you very much. Mississippi is still considered to be the most segregated state in the country, and Connecticut is second.
Connecticut's not even in the top 10.
I know.
No, unfortunately, or fortunately, Connecticut can't claim any of that part of the title.
Right, I know.
But growing up in Mississippi, well, the memory that I have, and I can go back and really think, is, and I'd mentioned it before, that my mother and father were married almost 14 years before I was born. I'm the oldest. They never thought they would have kids. And what they had done, which I look back now, was almost impossible. They had won the right to vote before I was born, and they were paying poll tax. But when you were to enter upon the grounds of the courthouse on the day that you were to vote, you had to show this document before you came on the ground, and it was stamped by the clerk and it was stamped by the sheriff, and they would intimidate you on that last, all the way into voting. And things that frighten you are indelible stamps. And I can tell you, I could feel the fear in my mother's breath when she was holding me in her arms when she went to vote when I was a little kid. Reverend Clarke, talked about the books. those books had broken bindings because when the white school got new ones, we got their old ones.
Okay.
But for some reason, we were expected to take the same SAT. If you were to look at the stats in Mississippi, when kids entered school and you looked at white kids and black kids, all of these kids went to first grade. But at 8th grade, there were fewer schools for black kids and the numbers just dropped off. The money was not put in. The expectation was not there because they expected us all to go to the fields. And when you paid, my parents worked and paid tax as well. Those tax dollars did not go to the degree to educate me in a way that would take me forward, but the other side of town. So in the question of the civil rights movement, I always think of the civil rights movement starting in the teens, not in the 60s.
Mm.
And I think there's one person on the panel who will probably agree with me.
Yes.
And one other thing about what you said, which kind of stunned me. You said Ms. Mosley, that you entered the Navy in 1948, and that the day Dr. King was assassinated, you were starting at EB.
Yes.
I was born in 1948.
Yeah.
And when Dr. King was assassinated, I was in the Navy in Norfolk, in uniform, joined in 10th grade in high school. And once I'm in my uniform, not a draft dodger, I went to rent a place and the person says, we don't rent to black people. This is 1968.
Yeah.
You know, so when we think about what you have to endure, you know, people say freedom is not free.
Yeah.
It is not free, but we pay too.
That's well said. Thank you, Attorney Braxton. Thank you very much for those remarks. Ms. McCoy, anything you would like to add?
Yes, so, you know, the good news for me is that, you know, the other folks that are on this panel, you know, they paved the way for me to not to have to endure many of the things that they're discussing. The one thing that in terms of segregation, and this is something that's still prevalent now, is that, you know, I live in a Black neighborhood, which was really a Black neighborhood after Jewish people fled after Martin Luther King's assassination. So then the education system started to wane after that particular moment in time. So they started talking about desegregating the schools. And at the time, I was going to a school in my neighborhood where, you know, I was able to walk from the babysitter's house and come back to her at the end of my school day. And then when they started talking about segregating the schools, that meant that I was going to have to be bused. And my mother, who was solely financially responsible for me, made the decision to send me to a Catholic school because she didn't want her only child to go onto a school bus and to see all of the unrest because white people were throwing things at the buses and calling names of the young Black children, young Black and brown children. So that to me was the tail end of it. And my mother literally took me out of that so that she wouldn't have, she was born in South Carolina, so she had seen it firsthand. So she didn't want me to experience that living in Boston.
Thank you very much, Ms. McCoy, for sharing that.
If I may, Reverend
please.
Clarke and Mr. Mosley, you know, this young lady just raised the issue about busing. Think about what busing was like for us in the South growing up. When there was one Black school in the county, and I don't care if you live 10 minutes from it, you could walk, but you may live 45 minutes or an hour, and you were bused to that one school.
Yeah.
And when you had a chance to look at how much was being spent per child, and like Mississippi, it was like 50 to 1, 100 to 1 for a Black child.
Absolutely.
It was amazing. You know, I had relatives who would be on a bus over an hour each way just to get to school. So busing was going on, and they passed a number of white schools on their way to their school.
Absolutely.
And Mr. Braxton, what year was that?
This is 65. This is 63.
Wow.
Well,
And thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
John Lewis once said, "The vote is the most powerful nonviolent tool we have."
Mhm.
The vote is the most powerful tool we have.
Right.
So the question that comes to my mind now is, should Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act, which was dismantled by the Supreme Court in 2013, be revisited? And are there other things we should consider in the Voting Rights Act?
Right.
And I'm going right to Reverend Florence Clark.
Yeah.
Question.
Thank you. Definitely. First of all, John Lewis is on my mind in a predominant way. I shared a birth date with him. He's exactly a year older than I am. He was born on February 21st, 1940, and I was born on February 21st, 1941. Kind of remembered what happened to him on Bloody Sunday. I will never forget that. And all that he went through so that we could get a civil rights bill signed. There were certain requirements in that civil rights bill that particularly affected states in the South, and they had to get permission from the federal government if they wanted to make any changes. And that lasted for about 40 years. And then when the Supreme Court became ultra conservative, they voted to scratch out, dismantle that Section 4, which meant that those states in the South could make changes and not have to get permission from the Justice Department or the federal government. And then that's when all of a sudden, after 40 years, that piece was taken out. And then that's when we saw all of this, particularly states in the South, wanting to add certain things to, you had to have a voter ID card, you had to live in a certain place. They started moving polling out of Black neighborhood and all of that as a result of just part of that dismantling in Section 4. I honestly do believe that it's time for that to be revisited. Now, there's another piece to that. The Democrats in the House presented a bill to reinstate Section 4. And today it sits on McConnell's desk because he won't present it to the Senate. It's already passed the House. So now we have to talk to our legislators, and particularly and one of the things that we need to do is please register and vote. I have to invoke that right now.
Absolutely.
So that we can get rid of these people who are hindrances. And let's go back and revisit that portion, see if we can get that back in so that we won't have any problems now with mail-in ballots, so that people will be able to go to the polls and vote. And the other thing that I propose, I'd love to see happen, any addition to the Voting Rights Act, is that that day of voting becomes a national holiday. Then everybody is off. Everybody can go and vote. You don't have to worry about getting, so these are some of the things that to answer the question, yes, it needs to be revisited.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Reverend Clarke, for your remarks. Attorney Braxton, the man who definitely has a deep passion for the law and a man who's a deep passion for voting rights, who dedicated his entire life.
Well,
Addressing the same question to you.
well, you know, the most important document I own is my mother's last poll tax receipt. And every time I hold it, it electrifies me, and just it makes me swell. Inside, it just makes my heart swell. Because if voting wasn't so important and voting wasn't such a powerful tool, there wouldn't be so much being done to impact it. This is called one person, no vote.
No, yes,
Please,
Yes.
please read it.
yes,
And if you don't think that
Yes.
things go on about your right to vote, read this, then call me.
yes,
When you have and see, you can't move either with your foot on my neck.
Oh,
You're trapped too.
oh,
In Florida, when they moved all of these polls and they closed a lot, not only did they impact people like me who look like me, there are a lot of elderly people in Florida who don't drive. They couldn't get to the polls either. Then you also have people who stopped driving who no longer have a license. There were women who basically got a license, never changed their name, no longer drive. Now they got a birth certificate, has a different name. There are all these things that are hooks and snares that were basically, for lack of a better word, denying people the right to vote.
wow.
Now, don't think, you know, we hear a lot about, well, you don't want it to be illegal. You don't want, you know, people who shouldn't vote voting and what have you. Well, most of the reports I have read, and if you were in the service, you mailed in a ballot.
absolutely.
You didn't drive to the poll. There are states that actually, basically everybody mails in a ballot. But I want to add one thing to what Reverend Clarke said. Please register and vote. But that's not enough. That's not enough. You need to register to vote, and on the day that you gotta go down to vote, make sure you show up. Because being registered is not even half of the battle.
Amen.
Voting is it. Because once you vote, you've done something. And when you are told it doesn't matter, it matters to the person who's on the other side, because you just voted for the person you may not particularly want in office. If you want to send a message to politicians, exercise your right to vote. Don't care what party, what your political persuasion is, you got to get in the game. And when people want to have serious political conversations with me, the first thing I want to know, did you vote? Because if you didn't, why have this conversation really?
Yeah.
You're not really in the game.
Wow. Attorney Braxton just said, please register and vote, right? That's what Reverend Florence Clark said first. And he said he wanted to add on to that. Make sure you show up and exercise your right to vote, because you got to get in the game. Ms. McCoy, anything else you would like to add to that question as well? Is she frozen there? Oh.
Yes, so one of the things, because we often talk about the fact that these southern states are now having these different rules to prevent voting, but there's also counties and townships in places like California, New York, North Carolina are also, and South Dakota, that are also impacted by the dismantling of Section 4. So yes, we definitely need to revisit it, and in such a way where we don't have all of these different rules and nuances around voting. And in addition to that, making it easier. I would even dare to say to add the internet into it as well. We use the internet to do everything else, that there's somehow or another, there has to be a way to add that dimension for those who are homebound, who are out of country, and don't have the ability to go to a poll and actually cast a vote.
I'd like to add one other thing, if I may.
Yeah, absolutely.
This is 2020.
Mm,
Women have had the right to vote for only 100 years.
Yes.
right.
Look at what the suffragettes went through to get the right to
Yeah.
vote.
Mm,
And if you think about them denying women the right to vote, when in fact, there's a display in a couple of museums here in Connecticut right now discussing and actually portraying what women went through.
Mhm.
You know, it just chased down. I mean, it is unbelievable. Yet, in 100 years, we think they always voted. Well, they didn't.
Mhm.
And there was a major battle, and it took years. And I'm thinking about a woman who was in Massachusetts, and this is 1782, I think, 83. And they were sitting around some of our founding fathers writing all of this great language about rights and voting. And this Black woman, who was basically a maid, asked why she wasn't included. I think I was just reading that recently in Jefferson's Pillow. I spoke to Mr. Mosley about that book. So I dug it back out just to kind of refresh some things for myself. So this battle has been going on a long time. And it's not going to end. And the best thing we can do to make sure that we keep that right and keep that franchise is show up at the polls ourselves, so those who are behind us won't be denied their rights.
absolutely. Reverend Clarke, please.
I need to say this before we got the Voting Rights Act. The year I graduated from South Carolina State College, that I could not wait. This is 1963. I could not wait to go to register to vote. I mean, James Clyburn, who is now Nancy Pelosi's right-hand man, he was our leader during that time when we were doing all the demonstrations and the sit-in.
Wow.
But so when I went down to register to vote, there was one or two things I had to do. You had to pay poll tax, or you had to read a section of the South Carolina State Constitution and interpret it to the registrar. So I wasn't going to give nobody my money because, first of all, I didn't have any. So I chose to read the Constitution. I deliberately misread portions of that Constitution to prove that the registrar could not even read because she did not realize. So these are the people who had these boundaries and barriers. Poll tax, or read, and a lot of our ancestors, our folks just couldn't read, and they didn't have money to pay poll tax. So therefore they couldn't register. So they were using all these things a long time ago.
Wow.
And those taxes came into being in the 1880s and 90s. My parents are paying $2, which has started, 30, 40, 50, 60 years before. But think about $2. People were working in the 20s and 30s and even 40s from Kansas to Kansas to make $2 and didn't even make that in a whole day. So when you were asking people to give up that money, they need that money to eat. So they were making great sacrifices.
That's right.
Mississippi was much nicer. You got a chance to pay the poll tax and interpret part of the Constitution.
Oh my gosh.
Mm.
Wow.
Mr. Mosley, what's coming to your mind right now? What are you thinking about? with voting
I'm
rights?
thinking about that Shelby County versus Holder
Oh,
Voting Rights Act. And when they stripped Section 4 from that act, they did away with the formula they were using for the southern states that had been doing so much. They had to get approval from the U.S. Justice Department. And no sooner than, because I talked to Lonnie on this last night, no sooner than Anthony Scalia was on the conservative group. I think he wrote the opinion, I'm not positive. But then he went up to Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island, and told some law school students, and I got a copy of it, law school students up there, that voting is a racial preference.
Mm.
And he said he's always been against judicial activism. However, like we said last night, he didn't mind it then. He said it's a preference, racial preference. This is Anthony Scalia now, a racial preference. But once that opinion went down in June of 2013, North Carolina and Texas, they were the first two to change their voting
First
laws.
two.
I forgot the county in North Carolina, 9 or 7, which the not the governor, but someone down there now that's in politics was, and I'm sure James Clyburn know all that too, even though he's in South Carolina. But the North Carolina thing, North Carolina and Texas, they changed the voting, the voting laws. That's when you see the voter ID, et cetera, and so forth. But as Mrs. Clark said, they want to name this new voting rights the John Lewis. It's sitting on Mitch McConnell's desk right now.
Yes.
And that's one thing they definitely need to change, because the 15th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified in 1870. And they're still violating, for the right to vote, they're still violating the 15th Amendment. And they always talk about the Second Amendment, this and that and so forth. And Mrs. Clark, I'll probably, sometime we got time, I'd like to talk to you about the history I've written about South Carolina, the Vesey, and by the way, the pastor at Mother Emanuel's church now is Reverend Goff. Are you familiar with him?
No, I'm not.
Well, my granddaughter that was here a couple hours ago, he performed the ceremony for her in New York, 2016. Reverend Goff at
Wow.
Mother Emanuel.
Wow.
But voting is the most important thing we can do in this country now. And
Right.
not only go to vote, take people with you.
Amen.
It's very important. I think it's the most important election coming up in our lifetime.
Thank you, Mr. Mosley.
Okay.
Thank you for sharing that with us. The Edmund Pettus Bridge in 2013 was declared a National Historic Landmark.
Mhm.
Isn't symbolic of the Civil War in a meaningful way. It is, however, the modern day battlefield where the voting rights movement was born. And John Lewis once said, "Get in good trouble,
Yeah.
necessary trouble,
Yeah.
and help redeem the soul of America."
Right.
So I want to know from my awesome panelists right now,
Yeah.
should the Edmund Pettus Bridge be renamed in honor of John Lewis or one of our other great trailblazers and pioneers who also worked along those lines and pushed people along the way and encouraged them and motivated them to move forward? I'm going to go right now to Attorney Braxton on this one.
Do I say I was baited or not?
I saw your face.
A few years back,
Yeah.
my kid and I, we go on these road trips, and I fancy myself as being a historian. And we both love the civil rights movement. So we drove to Selma, Alabama, marched across the Pettus Bridge, then left there and drove the 50+ miles to Montgomery.
Wow.
Wow.
And we were at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. Now we're going into detail. But as I said before, Lewis was not only a visionary, he was patient and he played the long game.
Mm.
That bridge can be walked over in less than 3 minutes. If we want to name it after him, I'm all for it. But I would name the road from Selma to Birmingham to Montgomery after him. And I would name the bridge after Joanne Bland.
Yeah.
Bland was the youngest person in the civil rights movement in Selma. her mother died when she was 7, 8 years old because she was waiting in the white waiting room for blood because they would not give her white blood. They would only give her a blood transfusion from a black person, and she died. This woman, and I made a couple of notes myself, she was also the co-founder and former director of the National Voting Rights Museum in Selma. And she was highly active and a participant in the civil rights movement. And everybody in that area is familiar with her. There's another guy by the name of Chestnut who was the first Black lawyer in Selma. But we have given so much accolades to all of the heroes of the civil rights movement. The sheroes were there too. They did an awful lot to make this thing happen.
Right.
And they should also be remembered, because as those of us who are passing and will be dust in a few years, they need to be memorialized, and people need to see a name and ask, who is that?
Yeah.
Awesome.
And that should be Joanne Bland.
Wow. Thank you. Ms. McCoy, what do you think?
Well, first of all, that closing right there has completely changed my thought process, which is steeped in bias. You know, when we talk about bias, we talk about bias for or against. And so I have this particular bias with Congressman Lewis because a good friend of mine was his chief of staff. And so I got a chance to meet him. And so whatever he is from an iconic standpoint, he's also that just on a one-to-one. So, you know, my bias would be to name the bridge after him. However, I also just in what you've said, thinking about it, if it's not a specific person, to name it something around the movement, whether it's Freedom Bridge or something that says that that bridge is significant to where we are right now.
Absolutely. And Mr. Mosley.
Okay.
What do you think?
I agree with Mr. Braxton.
Oh.
The road even could be Selma Montgomery Turnpike or whatever it is, that period of stretch between Selma and Montgomery, which I think is a good, but in the Congress, they're talking right now about naming it after John Lewis. And you've seen this picture many times, them going across that bridge. Does anyone know why he was wearing a trench coat carrying a knapsack? Does anyone?
No.
Oh God, I knew that.
Oh, you knew that.
And plus they expected to be in jail, and they brought their own
That's
food.
it.
Right,
That's
he
it.
had his
That's
lunch.
it.
He brought
That's
food.
They brought their own food.
Yes.
That's it. Yeah.
Wow.
And you know, in the rotunda of the Capitol, they have Emancipation Hall. In 2002, John Lewis and Blanche Lincoln, a female senator from Arkansas, they put together a program for people visiting the Capitol that they tell the history of the Capitol, which was started in 1793. It was finished in 1826. It was built by rented slaves from Virginia. And Lewis and Blanche Lincoln, Senator Blanche Lincoln, came up with the idea of having, when you go into the rotunda of the Capitol, that you get all the history of the people who built that building. And as I mentioned the other day about the at the top of the Capitol, the Statue of Freedom, right on the dome of the Capitol. It was built by slaves. They made the cast, the bronze cast, and originally, and Jefferson Davis, that you recognize that name, he was the Secretary of War at the time, and he was involved in that statue at the top of the Capitol also, and he became the president of the Confederacy. But he was at that time, and they made the picture, if you notice, it looked like a Native American woman with a shawl. But it was supposed to have been the goddess of Rome and the goddess of Greek, Minerva and Athena. But that the Capitol building has, and John Lewis is involved in this. involved in getting the history of the Capitol building told. As you go in, pamphlets, whatever it is, him and this senator got that information together. He was a great man.
Mm. Thank you very much, Mr. Mosley,
Mhm.
for your insight. I'm coming right to you right now, Reverend Clarke.
I agree with Gwendolyn, Miss Gwendolyn,
Mhm.
because of my bias,
Mhm.
John Lewis. But listening to Mr. Braxton, it could be a way where we could get 2 for 1.
Mm.
Ah,
Mhm. Yeah.
Wow,
We
Oh,
can
yeah.
get 2 for 1.
One.
that's awesome.
Yeah,
Interesting too.
it is.
I like that.
Yeah.
2 for 1.
yeah,
Yeah.
I like that too.
Yeah, that is awesome. Now, when I think about how many people in the, through the civil rights movement, and also many of you trailblazers who are in this panel discussion right now, you have endured many obstacles. And the first thing that comes to my mind is I think of Fannie Lou Hamer. And Fannie Lou Hamer once said, "I'm sick and tired of being
Sick and tired.
tired. I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired."
Mhm.
And the question that comes to my mind when I think of Fannie Lou Hamer is, what are some ways you still experience racial segregation and racism now? I mean, you poured out to some of the listeners and viewers right now how things have changed and some things have not changed. Many of you are in positions of power. You're retired now, but you're able to still give back. You're still navigating through spaces and sometimes even through white spaces who may not even know your title or know things that you have been through as well. How are you still dealing with racial segregation and racism now? Are you still enduring some of those obstacles? I see Mr. Mosley shaking his head. You're about to be 91 in 3 days. Please share with us.
Well, I could give you some recent things that has happened to me.
Mm.
In 2008, I got a ticket at the foot of my driveway for blocking my driveway.
Mm.
That was in 2008. 2010, I was working on my granddaughter's car at the foot of the driveway. I just got through cutting the grass, etc. And a police car pulled up and I had the hood up. A police car came up by my mailbox and I could see him through it because I had the hood up. And he walked, he looked around, and I just got through cutting the grass and I had dirty clothes on and so forth. He walked over to me, and this is 2010. He walked over to me and said, "Oh, you're having car problems." I said, "No, I'm just changing the battery terminals on my granddaughter's car." So he stood there a while and looked around. Then he said, "I smell something burning." I said, "This car hadn't been moved. There's nothing burning. I'm just putting terminals on." He looked around at the house and everything. He said, "You want your car towed somewhere?" I said, "I live right here."
Whoa.
And he didn't say much. He went back to his car, and I still had the hood up.
Mm.
He went back to his car and sat there about 10 minutes. You know what he was doing? He checking my license plate to make sure I lived in that house.
Mm.
And I've been paying taxes in this house for 60 years.
Oh my gosh.
And I'm the only black on this street. And there's only been one other black on the street that Mrs. Clark know. He passed
Yes.
away. Herbert
Yeah.
Lee.
Yes,
Herbert Lee. He lived next door to me.
yes.
I came here in 59. He came in 62. We're the only two
Wow.
blacks that ever lived on the street.
Oh my gosh.
You see it today. A lot of it is covert, but you see it. You see it even in this area. When I first came here in 1955, from being stationed a lot of places in the South, I was shocked at what I saw here in the 55 in the 60s. I was shocked what I've seen in New London County. Shocked. And a lot of it is still going on. And like I say, Mr. Booker, and I think Lonnie has read that book
Mm-hmm.
about some of the things I went through since I've been in this house. my wife was arrested. She passed away now. My first wife was arrested for arguing with a white woman right on the street. So you go through this. I've been going through this a lot of years. But things will get better. But we still face it. Most of it is covert.
That's right. Thank you, Mr. Mosley. Thank you. Reverend Clarke.
Yes. I can tell you something that happened a little while ago, and then as recent as a few months ago. That will forever be with me. The incident that happened a few years ago is when I retired from Electric Boat after working there for 25 years, and then three of my friends who are white took me out to an Italian restaurant because I know I love Italian food. And the food was great. And when we got ready to have coffee and dessert, I noticed that the waitress brought cups and saucers that were china that had blue ridge, but my cup and saucer was totally different than the other three. And I couldn't believe it. So I called the waitress and asked, what was the problem? And I was told that they had just ran out of china cups. There were no other clean china cups. So I said I wanted to speak to the manager. The manager was not there. So, oh no. Oh, I just lost you.
Oh, you're still there.
Are you still here?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
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 Okay, I don't know what happened. I have a blank. I'll finish telling the story and then I'll try to get back in. So, the bottom line, I asked the waitress, do they have white dishes and black dishes? She didn't have to answer because her complexion, everything changed. And that's been in me since when I go to a restaurant now. I still look around to see if there's black dishes and white dishes. My most recent one is I was in a place that I thought was a safe space to be because a lot of the places I go, I'm the only African-American that's there. I had just got through speaking and this white lady came up to me after almost everybody had left and she walked over to me. I had on a black dress and she got close to me and she said, don't wear black anymore. So I'd been called a lot of names, but I'd never heard that expression, nor had I ever been told that. I was speechless. My first thought was to call my daughter to see if she had money to get me out of jail because I was going to punch her in her mouth. And I wanted to be sure that my daughter could pay my bail, but that wouldn't have been good. So wisdom said, just be quiet and compose yourself. So I knew there was going to be something coming after that. I didn't even have to ask her why. But her reason came, don't wear black because when you wear black, you disappear. I'm not talking about 10 years ago. I'm not talking about 5 years ago. I'm not talking about 2 years ago. I'm talking about recent in Connecticut, but I was in a suburb. It's still there. I just wanted to share that. I'm going to try to get back in. I'm done.
Reverend Clarke, thank you.
Wow.
Thank you for sharing that. Attorney Braxton.
Well, I'm the guy who has spent a lot of years. I love data. I was a geek as a kid. And the one thing that I can unequivocally say, if you're a person of color, you pay a black tax. Recently, there was an interesting article I read that we own a piece of property. We tend to pay higher taxes for someone with a similar home. And the alternative, in the same neighborhood, same house, our house will be valued less. We'll pay more for insurance. But I can tell you, it was a 17-year trek for me to become a lawyer. Came here with no money, worked at EB, did all kinds of odd jobs, just would never give up. And at the end of the day, prevailed, became a lawyer, and I've been in both federal and state court with a client, and I've had judges mistake me for the defendant. So justice may be blind, but once in a while, I think she peeks.
Yes, she does.
Wow. Ms. McCoy.
Yes, so Mr. Mosley made a point earlier about a lot of things that happen today are more covert, even though we have examples of things that are much less covert. Microaggressions are something that I encounter on a fairly regular basis, and microaggressions being those subtle, insults and snubs that people will do, to try to marginalize you in that way. So the most recent for me was on June 1st during our regular client meeting. So the consultancy I work with, we talk about the clients and what their needs are. And my principal mentioned something about sometimes you have difficult clients and, don't take it personal, things that they may ask for, or those preferences or those biases. And then she went on to say that one of our clients thought that it would be so much better and that the leadership would be so much more engaged if she was the only one that did the training. And, this was June 1st, which is the day after the social unrest kicked into full gear. And I thought that it was so interesting that she would try to exclude me in that way on the day after the protest started. So needless to say, I wasn't happy. And in fact, I took that as my call to action to tap out at that point. So I no longer deal with that client at all, and it's their loss. So yeah, it still happens for sure.
Jeez. Thank you very much, Ms. McCoy. It's a lot to take in. And I'm just listening to all you trailblazers in this panel right now. And I know many of you are very hopeful for the future. And because you have stressed that and emphasized that throughout this discussion. And when I think about, the future, and I think about America and the direction we're going in, Mr. Mosley, Reverend Clarke, Attorney Braxton, Ms. McCoy, you all talked about the young people and how your eyes get brightened up and you say to yourselves, there's definitely future. We know there's going to be some changes are occurring, and we see the changes occurring. And the question I have for many of you right now, for people who are watching this throughout the world, because this is social media. So now people can really get to see, they can't say this is not happening. Okay. So what is one thing or a couple things you want people to take away from this conversation and apply in their everyday life? Because some people are just tired. I hear people say, I'm just exhausted. I'm tired. I have to put on this mask. I have to continue moving forward. I'm exhausted. And many of you have been dealing with this for a long time and you're working through all this. Can you help give people some tools? Just something that you can leave them with, that sense of hope, so they can continue moving forward. As many people are exhausted, and just like some of you have shed light in here on some of the things that you're still dealing with as well. And it bothers me right now, to be honest, just hearing that you still dealing with some of these things. So I'm just going to leave this open right now. Who would like to go first? Mr. Mosley.
I think the most important thing for anyone to do with that, as far as advancing what's going on with the protests right now, is to vote and get involved in a political process, because that's where the changes come. And it's going to be very difficult because the current Senate Majority Leader, Mr. McConnell, has approved with the president so many judges who's going to be making the laws that people have to abide by for the future. Presidents come and go, but court justices, they're there for life, as long as they don't get into trouble. They can be impeached also. They're removed from the bench. But the number of judges presently that this administration has put on benches is over 200. And they'll be making the laws for us in the future. So voting, and I can't repeat that often enough, you have to vote, and the younger people have to be part of the political process, which I think is happening right now when you see the number of people running for Congress, the diversity of it and so forth. That's what it's going to change it. You've got to get people involved, the younger people involved in the politics, and aspire to offices higher. It's like Lonnie said, the woman's only been voting for 100 years. And now you're seeing so many of them in the Congress, nominees, people aspiring to be in the House and so forth. So things will be changing. But the major thing is vote without ceasing. And not like the Chicago people used to say as a joke, vote early and vote often. But you have to vote. And statistics have shown that the African American community as a group vote less than any other ethnic group.
Wow.
And they're the ones that people lost their lives to get the right to vote. And the 15th Amendment is being violated every day by keeping people from voting in different ways. And it's still going on as we speak, about the census and about things such as that. And a lot is going on behind the scenes to keep a lot of people from voting, because most people don't want to stand in lines for hours to cast a ballot. But you have to do what you have to do. Because when Nelson Mandela became president of South Africa, people stood in lines for 8 and 10 hours to vote because they knew the importance of it. So one word, vote.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mosley, for your profound words. Okay. Reverend Clarke.
I guess the one thing that I would want people to take away from our conversation today is that there is a cause. There are lots of things that are wrong, have been wrong for such a long time. And decide which one can become your passion. That'll be in your gut. And then make up your mind to make a difference for change. You have a voice, speak up. But after speaking up, do something. Do something. Do something. that will make a difference.
Wow. Thank you very much, Reverend Clarke. Thank you. Ms. McCoy?
So there's two things that come to mind. First of all, listen and listen and listen to your elders, to the people in your community, to folks who have been doing this work. Our history is our best defense in terms of being able to activate what our next steps are going to be. And so that's the one thing in terms of listening to those across the generations. I think that that is extremely important. And then secondly, be willing to learn as well. Oftentimes when our white counterparts look at us, they think we know the entire story. And most times we do not. I mean, all that I've learned just in this call alone tells me that there's much more to know. So those are the two things: listen and learn. It will activate everything else.
Thank you, Ms. McCoy. Thank you. And the last one, Attorney Braxton.
Wow. Well, I'll echo everything that's been said prior.
Mhm.
However, I'd like to add that we cannot allow the labor of those who came before us to go unrecognized or forgotten. And that takes hope. And so long as we keep hope, love, and a bit of determination and grit in it, we'll keep moving forward. Because the young people who are behind us, we have left them part of a road, but with no blueprint as to where to go. We are pointing in a direction, but that's all. You don't really see an outline of anything, just into the distance. So the thing I want them to get out of it is that it was hard for us. It was harder for those before us, and even harder for the ones before. But if they wanted to get better, it is their turn to put their shoulder to the wheel and push and push and keep on pushing, because things will get better.
Thank you very much, Attorney Braxton, for those profound words. Thank you. And thank you to all of you, trailblazers, who are pioneers in our community, throughout our state. I mean, you're phenomenal individuals. Phenomenal. It's an honor to even be in this discussion with you. Erica Watson, she's going to leave us, she's going to summarize our entire discussion right now and leave us with some closing remarks. And then after we have closing remarks, Reverend Florence Clark will lead us in prayer.
Thank you. I echo what you just said, Kevin. I feel so honored and blessed and taught and influenced and strengthened to be in this room with everyone here, with my elders. And I'll start off with my takeaway. Although we had such obvious discrimination just 50 years ago, 100 years ago, we still face systemic racism. You know, Kevin, when he travels through towns, he has to watch how he dresses and talks and acts. I know my contributions and influence are often dismissed in a professional setting, and systemic racism destroys our educational and health options. It just looks different today. So it's inspiring to hear that this panel has so much faith in the generations to come. There was so much information. I was trying to capture everything and summarize it. When we talked about describing the progress in the fight for racial justice, I noted that the majority, everyone actually said that we've had more contact in the past 30 years between different ethnic groups. I believe Attorney Braxton referenced having that Thanksgiving diversity, whereas before, you know, it was one ethnic group sitting at the Thanksgiving table, and now you may have friends who look completely different from you. And that's a recent phenomenon that we need to respect and appreciate. We also have the internet that connects us more. The internet connects us locally, it connects us nationally, and it connects us globally. Talking about describing an experience with segregation prior to civil rights, Senior Chief Mosley, by the way, hi, Senior Chief. I just want to say personal hi. Was stationed in the South in the military, and he realized that when he went overseas, he was treated better there than he was here. Reverend Clarke referenced the Woolworth experience, which I thought was pretty phenomenal. As a child, she thought that at the segregated drinking fountains, she should choose the white fountain because why would she want to drink colored water? And her grandma became afraid because she made that choice to drink at the white fountain. Attorney Braxton talked about how he felt the fear in his mother's breath with regards to going to vote. And that's a palpable, emotional, memorable experience that is really deep to share with us. So I appreciate that. And then Mrs. McCoy talked about her mother who raised her as the sole financial person in her life. And her mom chose to send her to Catholic school just to avoid discrimination in the schools. With regards to renaming the bridge, there was an overwhelming yes from professional and personal experiences. Reverend Clarke actually recommended, and we all agree, I'm sure, that we have a day of voting that becomes a national holiday. Attorney Braxton said, if voting were so important, then we wouldn't have such issues. And he recommended a book called One Person, No Vote. We have all of these challenges that deny people the right to vote. For example, there are some people who can't drive to a physical poll booth. There are some people who have name changes that haven't been updated, etc. Mrs. McCoy mentioned that we need to add accessibility for those who can't physically get to a poll. And Senior Chief Mosley says, again, we need to recognize that we continually violate the 15th Amendment to vote, the 15th Amendment right to vote when we engage in these practices. Let's rename the bridge. And it was recommended by Attorney Braxton that we rename it after a young woman, Joanne Bland, who was the youngest. What's that?
No, just Joanne Bland.
Yes, she was the youngest in the civil rights movement in Selma. We need to rename that whole strip, the whole bridge after her, and perhaps rename the whole strip from Selma to Montgomery after John Lewis. It would be, as Reverend Clarke said, a 2-for-1. What are some of the ways that we experience racial segregation today? This was key. Kevin started off by saying we're sick and tired of being sick and tired, and this is a famous quotation from Fannie Lou Hamer, a civil rights leader in the past. Senior Chief Mosley mentioned 2 police incidents on his own property where essentially they didn't believe that that was his property. And Reverend Clarke experienced white folks, goodness, this one actually almost brought me to tears too. White folks in a restaurant giving her the lower class, basically, drinking and eating wear, and and another person making a comment how she shouldn't wear black because black made her fade out. And Mrs. McCoy experiences microaggressions on the regular. Mrs. McCoy, I'm right there every day. In fact, I just experienced one 2 days ago. So these are personal experiences that folks bring to the table. And I think it's important to just wrap up with what we said we can do to improve these circumstances. I heard everybody say vote, get there to vote, and bring others. Decide on what your passion is, make up your mind to make a difference, use your voice, then do something that will make a difference. Listen, and listen across the generations, be willing to learn. And don't forget the labor of those before us, and keep love, hope, and grit at the forefront. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Watson. Thank you. Reverend Clarke, can you close us off with a prayer, please?
Yes,
We appreciate it.
let us pray. To the God who said, I am, that I am, to the God who said, I am enough. We thank you for this holy privilege that we have had to just talk with one another. We spoke of a journey that's been long and hard, and yet we keep pressing on because of you. You've been the God of our weariness, and we have hope. Give us renewed faith. Give some faith for the first time, so that we can say like our ancestors, I ain't got tired yet. The time we're living in calls for hanging in there because the wind of change is blowing. We pray for healing so that hurt people won't hurt people. That those who rule in the fear of a just God. Bless those who mourn with your comfort. Let your love flow like a river, touching us from ankles to over our heads. Then and only then we shall all be free. We are grateful for your mercy and your grace. Hear our prayer, O Lord. We pray it in the name that is above all names. Amen.
Amen.
Man.
Just want to say thank you so much to all of you. You are Trailblazers. It was an honor to moderate this discussion this evening. It was an honor. I love you all. I appreciate you so much. Gosh.
Thank you so much.
If you can cross your arms this way right here, just like this. Even you, Attorney Braxton.
If you want to do
I'm
something,
giving you all a hug.
let us wish an early happy birthday.
That's right.
Yes.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday.
Yes.
91.
Yep.
August the 12th.
August 12th. Wow.
Wow. So, and thank you all, people who are watching this, the viewers. We want to thank you all for watching this as well. It was a great experience. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good night.
All right.
Good night.
Ready?
Yeah.
Stay there. Stay there 1 second.